Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We are back with another episode of the InterDrone Podcast, your 30,000-foot view of the commercial drone industry. It is Tuesday, July 14th. My name is CJ Smith with the InterDrone team. I am joined today with Michael Pehel, chairman of InterDrone, and we have two fantastic guests with us today. We are joined with Patrick Sherman. He's the founder of Roswell Flight Test Crew, and Miriam McNabb. She's the editor-in-chief at dronelife.com. We'll be talking about a few articles of hers today. If you guys wouldn't mind just giving a brief introduction of yourselves, some of the work that you do in the space, and maybe how you kind of made your way into drones. And I'd love to start with you, Patrick, and then Miriam.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to be having this conversation right now because I entered the commercial drone space, although we didn't recognize it as such, almost precisely 10 years ago. Oh. And so we were sort of pathfinders. We were the ones tearing apart Nintendo Wii's to get at their precious accelerometers and gyroscopes, which we used to stabilize our early drones, and did a lot of, I certainly don't want to say crazy. They were as controlled as we could make them, let's put it that way. But we had the opportunity to fly alongside hot air balloons and firefighters all the way back in 2011. We flew our first thermal camera back in 2012. And the premise, our sort of goal through all this has always been to share everything we learn, to make it available so other people can, use this technology to its best effect. And that's never really changed. So there you go. So I've always sort of considered myself an educator in the field, trying to share what I learned, best practices, etc. And that's a trend that continues today.
Great.
So it's super nice to be on the podcast with you, Patrick, because as we know, we've worked together before. Drone Life is also about kind of sharing information about the commercial drone industry. So we got into drones, comparatively newcomers compared to Patrick's group. We've been around since about 2013. And it was been in technology my whole career, but this is a new field for us. So I'm a sort of fascinated observer. To date, I've written over 2,000 articles on the commercial drone industry. Just keep following along, and I'm really excited to see what happens next.
Great. Well, yeah, and we're really excited to have you guys on. If anyone's tuning in for the first time, the format of this podcast, we talked through a couple articles from the past week, and then we'll shift into the interview portion of the podcast with our interview guest. Today is Patrick Sherman. So make sure to stick around for that. So I know we have a lot to get to today, a couple hard stops in about an hour, so we'll dive right in. Coming from dronelife.com, this is one of Miriam's articles. The US DoD invests in drone companies through the CARES Act. So the Department of Defense announced $13.4 million in Title III investments as part of the national response to COVID-19 and to support small domestic unmanned aerial systems. So this was done through the CARES Act. Many businesses of different sizes, I'm sure, are aware of some of the stimulus that has been coming out of Congress. The awards were made to 5 U.S.-based companies: AirMap, ModalAI, Skydio, Graffiti Enterprises, and Obsidian Sensors. The 5 companies represent a variety in the drone area, in the drone industry, from unmanned traffic management, UTM, hardware, software, and sensors. So. Marion, I'd love to start with you on this. Can you maybe just take us a little step further? I mean, there's much more that you wrote about in this article, and we'll put the link in the description. But, question for you and for the group. I mean, what do we think kind of about this investment, and what do we think about the 5 companies chosen?
I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'll tell you why. I think that this is a real indication that the U.S. government has decided that drones are critical, that drones represent critical production. So if you think about all the other things that they've chosen to invest in to protect domestic production. So the idea here is not necessarily that, poor Skydio or poor AirMap, we have to give them money. That's not it. Right. It's really that we have to support these domestic industries and make sure that they succeed so that we maintain that domestic production capability. And they've done that with things like shipbuilding. They've done it with things like the factories that create the fabric for U.S. military uniforms. Anytime they have a production or a manufacturing capacity that they believe is critical to keep going in the US. And so I think it's incredibly interesting that they decided that drone technology was one of those things that is critical to our success, that we need to keep that production capacity available and expanding here in the US.
Any thoughts on the names, Patrick? The companies that are up there?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm only familiar with a few of them, probably the ones that are universally known in the industry, like AirMap and Skydio. And speaking to it overall, I would say that I think it's a good thing, like Miriam said, although I sadly don't share her optimism. I mean, I think she's right. I think this signals, that the U.S. As a matter of national policy is beginning to take the question of drones seriously. However, I am dubious of the ability of the federal government in particular to sort of see through industrial policy to its natural conclusion. And the reasons for that I would point to are things like our space program, which has literally been stuck in orbit for 50 years since the Apollo mission, and also the decades-long efforts for the FAA to upgrade to the next-gen air traffic control system. The problem is, to really make industrial policy work takes certainly not a one-off, and not even a 2-year initiative or something. It has to go on for a decade or more. And this is no knock against any party or any politician, because it's gone both ways on either side. But a new administration comes in and they want to do it their way, and they want to go to the Mars instead of the moon or whatever. And so, the previous 4 years of investment largely gets scrapped, and then it starts over. And with next gen funding for the FAA, one administration thinks it's great, pours money into it. They lay out, software contracts to develop it. The next administration rips that money away, and and so they're stuck. And then the third administration wants to know why they haven't made any progress on next gen. So I think that I think this is a great development. I certainly hope it's the beginning of sort of a concerted industrial policy surrounding drones, which I think we urgently need in this country. I just don't have confidence that will be the outcome. And again, this is, administrations on both sides of the aisle going back decades have demonstrated this sort of short-sightedness. So maybe this will be the time it changes.
Well, I think I'll split the difference, and this has kind of been an evolving conversation on this podcast that really kicked off when we had Vic Moss and Brian Garrett Glazer on. So the first thing I'll start out is the amount seems low. I wish that there was more money. I always want more money for drones, specifically on the commercial side. And I really do want to see, there's a lot of kind of little mini projects on the DoD side that are investing in drones, dipping their toe in the water, researching drones. It's nice to see an extra step in commitment, but I want to see more commitment. But to Patrick's point about the kind of, talking about the government in its ability to actually succeed on projects, and understanding the limitation of that actually turnover, right? As the factor that kind of slows things down. If we're really going to invest in drones, it's got to be a real investment to make sure we get over that hill of interest where essentially it's almost like the guilt of the new administration come in saying, wait, we spent $100 million on this. We've spent $2 trillion on this. Well, I guess we need to spend $1 trillion more just to make sure it actually gets done. So hopefully this is actually just the beginning of a commitment to get things on this road actually moving. I think they chose great companies. If anybody saw what Skydio put out this week, I think they kept a lot of that progress quiet. It was a nice drop to see from them because it answered a lot of the doubts that I was having about what their potential was post Skydio 2, right? So it seems like they're moving, seems like they're getting investment. And it's interesting to note that their investment individually as a company, that they were able to raise 100 million compared to this. So almost tenfold in the private sector. So, I don't care where the money comes from. I think it's nice to have the U.S. government thumbs up and that even in times like this, we're still getting investment into the drone industry from private equity.
And I would say too, Patrick, I totally agree with you. Like I'm not totally optimistic about government programs, unfortunately. Again, and no blame, everybody's blamed, I guess, not one party over the other. But I do have a lot of faith in the drone industry. I have faith in those companies to be able to take that money and run with it. You know, Skydio getting $4 million from the U.S. government is maybe not as significant as the almost $5 million in contracts that they've gotten from the U.S. government, you know, to produce those drones. And then the $100 million of funding to help them expand their company and their production capabilities. So while I wouldn't rely necessarily solely on one government program to make them work, I think those companies are going to take it and run with it. That I'm optimistic about.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And by the way, I've got to throw a little brag in here. As a journalist, I'm sure Miriam will understand this impulse. In an issue of Rotodrone magazine last year, I predicted after Exponential that that Skydio had a larger public safety type aircraft they were working on quietly in the background with thermal imaging capabilities and a few other things. And lo and behold, yesterday they announced it. So score one for me as an industry analyst. The best part is that $5
yeah.
off at Starbucks.
Yeah.
For anybody that wants to take it, just for people that are listening and maybe didn't see the Skydio announcement, does anyone want to just catch everyone up to speed on what happened?
I can do that if you want, because I just did an interview with Adam Bry yesterday. It was so fun. So Skydio introduced their X2 series, one of which is designed for the military. It's a SSR drone, and the other one, which is really designed for enterprise. And they just had some, again, it's thermal camera equipped, as Patrick mentioned, perfect for public safety, also like enterprise inspections, just some amazing software and sensor capabilities, new in addition to Skydio's sort of autonomy. So this is really a great thing for them. It's kind of significant because what Skydio is most good at is, you know, flying a manual drone can be tricky. And so they've sort of tried to eliminate that trickiness. But when you're talking about the enterprise, you need your workmen to just be able to have a drone in their tool bag. You don't want to necessarily have to schedule separate drone pilots to do all those jobs. You want your existing workforce to be able to do those jobs. Skydio's autonomy does make that a lot easier.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And on the manned versus unmanned, autonomous versus unautonomous debate, we're going to move into our second article. So this is by an author named Russ Niles from avweb.com. His article is titled "Drone Collisions, Maybe Humans Are the Problem." So this is less reporting a piece of news than really just kind of bringing up a debate that's it's kind of spawning from a couple different news stories. So he specifically points out a police helicopter hitting a police drone in northern Canada in February, which wasn't reported until June. And then similarly in Los Angeles, just on Monday, there was a helicopter, a chopper cruising at 1,100 feet over downtown Los Angeles. The pilot heard what he thought was a bird strike, and he was able to land safely. And the author writes that, luckily there were no casualties, but there may have been. He says he expects that in the remainder of his aviation journalism career, he or his colleagues will report on a collision that brings down a manned aircraft with casualties. Which obviously is something that we pray doesn't happen, but it brings up this issue that, he's wondering that are humans kind of the cause of some of these crashes. The top comment on this article says that the hardest part of designing autonomous systems is the accounting for unpredictability, the lack of reliability of the human operators or co-participating vehicles. So this is kind of a similar debate to driverless cars. People are saying there'll be fewer crashes. Traffic will be better with driverless cars. Patrick, I'd love to just kind of kick this off to you to start us off. Where do you sit in this manned versus unmanned debate? Will the skies truly be safer with everything autonomous?
Well, I think if every single thing was autonomous and they were all talking to each other, that would be the safest, until we get some sort of, HAL 9000 problem going. But that's a question for another day. I have to disagree pretty vehemently with the premise of this article. Manned aircraft have the right of way. The people in them, some of whom are paying passengers, are the ones at risk. The worst thing that can happen when I lift off a $2,000 drone is that I never see it again. I'm out $2,000. When you got people in the sky, they're potentially out their lives. So I think that the onus to avoid collisions is, and rightly should be, with the drone pilot. And in both these cases, I'm really struck by the fact that I shouldn't speak to the Canadian case because I'm not familiar with their rules and regulations, but the one in Los Angeles, there was some initial question that the person could have been flying, that is the drone pilot, could have been flying within Part 107 because he may have been within 400 feet of some of the tall buildings in downtown Los Angeles. But if you're a drone pilot and you have visual line of sight with your aircraft, how on earth is it possible for a loud, human piloted helicopter to sneak up on you? I don't buy it. I mean, we'll need to wait until we'll see what the NTSB says. But I mean, when I'm out flying, at the very list of my list of worries is, what if a crewed aircraft enters this flying environment? How am I going to get my machine out of the way? Was the drone pilot listening in on radio traffic to help him maintain situational awareness? Have an ADS-B in receiver? We're too cheap, too nimble, and the regulations are set up to really make it easy to dodge these sorts of problems. So, like you said, the article raises some interesting philosophical questions, which will no doubt reverberate for the future. But I think for drone pilots to say manned aircraft need to get out of our way is going to be a big time losing argument right now.
Mm-hmm. Miriam, Mike?
I mean, I think there's always going to be antagonism between manned aircraft pilots and drone pilots on some level. I think like the common thread is always safety, right? The best drone pilots understand that. I think we're kind of caught in between this idea of a perfect system with remote ID where they're all talking to each other, that it, as simple as it sounds, is probably years off, because we also have to get the people on the ground to organize around the decisions with that. I doubt actually, though, that there will be a manned aircraft, and I hope I'm absolutely right about this. I can be wrong. I doubt that there will be one that gets taken down by a drone, just because most drone pilots aren't interacting in a space with that manned aircraft for the reason that Patrick's talking about. There's enough drones in the sky, or enough drones owned by people now that actually statistically we would have expected it to happen by now. Are we buying time? I hope not. But we've got a long way to go on regulation. I don't think these discussions are going to stop. On the automation front, what Patrick was talking about, having like a perfect system that talks to each other, that's actually what's required, because humans in that system, we create a lot of randomness that has to be accounted for. The big question with drones is, unlike driverless cars, is does the 3D space give them an advantage to navigate around other obstacles? I would say yes. I'd say it's probably easier to dodge other objects using some base level detect and avoid technology than solving the driverless car problem actually is confronted with. So I'm hoping that keeps us safe enough, because that technology seems to be evolving very fast, especially recently at scale. Skydio, perfect example, lots of stuff coming out of drone code. DJI has their own stuff that we might not have to, it might not be a concern. It'll be a reduced concern in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hoping too. I mean, Mike, you and I are in agreement on this. And you should never write an article when you're frustrated. But when I read that NTSB report on the Los Angeles incident, I got frustrated, and I wrote an article which got me, in equal parts, a lot of hate and a lot of love, which is, and where I said, kind of, hey, there was an incident. And what happened was exactly what was supposed to happen. The guy landed, he found a dent, he went on his way. We are critical of the operator. That's fine. But my concern is that if the expectation is that every operator is going to behave logically and carefully and appropriately in every situation, then we're not going to have a drone industry, because that just doesn't happen. I mean, we have plenty of laws on the roads. We have stop signs, and we have stoplights, and we have speed limits, and we have passing laws. And let me tell you, I have seen plenty of people blow them by and ignore them and do idiotic things and rely on the other people to get out of their way. And, people are people. So this guy's premise that sometimes humans are the problem, gotta say, I sort of agree with him. The humans are the problem. The technology's not really the problem. It's people doing stupid things. And you can't legislate that out of existence.
No, and if you think about small aircraft, small manned aircraft, that's where a lot of the accidents happen in the sky. So it's not a commercial kind of airline pilot, because there's so much regimentation there that kind of goes through the process. It's usually, the weekend flyer.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
on both sides, with the unmanned and the manned aircraft.
Right. So, and then we're holding the commercial operators back because they're kind of equated. And I've heard a thesis about when they what was it, Part 33? I forget. It was during the 2018 Reauthorization Act that they actually published. Oh, it was who did we have on that said this? Brendan Torres, right? Who said that it was probably actually a bad idea to bring hobbyists in to the consideration there, because now we've equated commercial operations with hobbyists, and clearly commercial operators hold themselves to a higher level of safety than the hobbyist does. And in general, the hobbyist flight is not going to be interacting in airspace that's dangerous to interact in. And if somebody's flying a drone by an airport, that's kind of already covered.
I mean, that my feeling is we should throw all the support we can behind the AMA and those other organizations who are really doing a fabulous job providing hobbyists with opportunities. So I would like to see their operations limited as little as possible, because they are bringing up the standard of awareness and training.
Well, I think we'll find out this year, right? So what it all means, really. It's going to be a pivotal year.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just wanted to jump back in with a small point. And actually, Mike, you already touched on it. Miriam said, and broadly correctly, that any system with humans in it is necessarily going to have periodic failures. Yeah, and you made the excellent point of traffic, collisions on the ground. However, I can't help but think, and this is where it goes back to what Mike said, that we can have an extremely safe aviation environment, and commercial aviation is it. We have 1 billion, well, obviously this is pre-pandemic statistics, but 1 billion annual passengers, and in several recent years we've had 0 fatalities. I mean, that's extraordinary. And to my mind, the Part 107 commercial operator should be no different than the commercial airline pilot. Obviously, that's an ideal, but I mean, the point is, as long as everyone is maintained being professional and following the rules, there isn't a way this should happen. And I also worry. I mean, I guess we got lucky here, but when that drone hit that helicopter in California, yes, the manned aircraft was able to land successfully, inspect, and carry on. But what happened to that 2-pound or 5-pound drone that came crashing out of the sky from 1,100 feet over the densely populated downtown Los Angeles? That could have easily killed somebody on the ground. So like I said, I sort of don't buy into the people inside the manned aircraft are the problem. the FAA has made it quite explicit through 107 that we are to get out of their way. And again, loud helicopters at 1,100 feet don't sneak up on drones, not if the operator's following the rules and is awake.
Right.
In some cases, we're held to a much higher standard, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, it's not the person in the manned aircraft. It's all the people, like the people driving the drone. Now, the problem is that you can't walk into Best Buy and buy a manned aircraft.
747.
And you can't just like fly it out of your backyard either.
Yeah, and there's no registration at the point of sale.
Problem here.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and all those things kind of feed into the atmosphere of anxiety that you know, makes situations like this worse. Like, these are 2 that are reported, and I bet if you're a weekend flyer right now, you're wondering about how many that aren't.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
you know, that's if it happened once, it probably happened elsewhere. So I totally empathize with you know, manned aircraft pilots and their concerns here. I just you know, I just think that we're you know, drones are relatively safe, and it comes down to the operator responsibility, like everything else. When you're using a tool, if we haven't informed the public enough about the dangers of flying a drone recklessly, then that's a whole other conversation. But I think we kind of got to start there and work backwards.
I'm sure that's a point we can all agree on.
Yeah, right. Well, we're going to jump into this third article. So we're going to look at our brothers and sisters to the north. So we're looking to Canada. Canada proposes to allow low-risk BVLOS operations for large drones. So Transport Canada has issued a proposal that would allow large drones, such as cargo drones, to fly beyond visual line of sight when traveling in remote areas. The proposal would accommodate drones which weigh 650 kilos, or a little over 400 pounds, sorry, 1,400 pounds. And this would allow for expanded operations in Canada's largely sparsely populated areas where energy industry is engaged and where drone delivery might be most useful. So, Miriam, this is another article on drone life. I know you didn't exactly author this. This was written by Harry. But what were some of your guys' thoughts when seeing this and seeing this news coming out of Canada?
Yeah, I think that this is another great example. I like this article because what it shows is an approach of the Canadian airport authorities, air transportation authorities, of saying, okay, so obviously we're not going to have cargo drones, flying over Toronto. However, there's no good reason when we estimate risk that we shouldn't kind of move to allow what we can allow with a very low risk. And so they're looking at these really sparsely populated areas. And if you think about where is drone transportation, where is cargo drone kind of thing most useful, it's where there's fewer people, less road infrastructure. So right terrain. In those areas, absolutely, it has the most value and the lowest risk. There's just no people there. So to say, and if you look at the article closely, CAA said very specifically, we're trying to move forward. We hear you. We're trying to move forward on drone delivery. We're trying to move forward on expanded operations. So we're going to take this approach where we say, okay, go for it in these areas where the risk is really very, very low. Prove your use case there, and then we'll talk. And I think that that's a very reasonable way to go. It also provides a lot of value for the industry that's working in those areas, and it provides value for the drone industry because we do have the opportunity to prove the use case, prove the safety of the technology.
Yeah, I'm excited by the sheer weight on record there for the
drone,
right?
Yeah, crazy.
That's like a no turning back point. Like, this is we're not talking lightweight drones, and we're allowing these for BVLOS. So I think this is exciting. I think this and the FAA announcement last week about working with Swiss FOCA for kind of developing international testing. I think the Swiss have a great system for, what is it called? It's basically trial and assessment. So they're more willing because of, understanding their airspace, having kind of the mountainous regions to test in, to run an experiment, even across the lake in Zurich, from one side to the other. And we're going to be able to use that data here in the United States. So I think a lot of what people felt was downward pressure stopping progress from happening. I think the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of opening up, and it's going to be intelligent and it's going to be data based. So this announcement in Canada is kind of just cherry on the cake for me, because it's so big, and I just don't think we can turn back the wheel of progress after this one.
Yeah, I'm going to unfortunately sort of we're not going to
Ruin the
stoke any
party.
controversy here, because I agree with everything everybody just said. It seems like a big opportunity to move forward. The scale is just kind of, it's hard to imagine for those of us who've been in the tiny little drone industry, a 1,400-pound drone. And I was going to say, when you talk sparsely populated, Canadian sparsely populated is way more sparsely populated than, say, American populated. When I first read this article, I was a little concerned about, gee, a 1,400-pound drone landing on your head could really ruin your whole day. But I mean, the CAA are no slouches when it comes to regulating drones. In fact, to the extent I'm aware of sort of what their program is, it's often struck me as being too conservative. So I think this is nothing but a good thing. I think it'll push the industry forward worldwide, and I say good on the CAA for allowing it. I think it's a good step.
Yeah, I remember
we need that data.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
need that
too.
We need the data from the use cases. No country in the world is. They need the data, so it has to happen somewhere to gather the data in order for them to make determinations about the use in countries where sparsely populated means less sparsely populated.
Really sparse.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm talking about with the FAA Swiss FOCA thing. The more we're sharing data between countries, the more we could actually advance things, because certain countries have literally geological kind of limitations or benefits that allow them to do certain kind of tests safely. And once that data is on the record, then the rest of us can use it to expand and scale operations.
Right.
As you say that, it reminds me of Zipline and their work in Africa.
Yep.
That's just another prime example of that. I mean, that's an amazingly sophisticated system, and
and
you'd still be working through the initial layer of approvals if you're trying to do that in the United States.
Yeah.
And we had Judith Sherman from UNICEF. She helped build the drone corridor in Malawi. And that wasn't even that's an NGO, not a private for-profit like Zipline. So it's really having the need on the ground and the use case. She was able to build out a drone corridor in a very, very mountainous country, and they're also using it for farming there, and they get an extra edge because a drone can improve crop yield in an area like that a lot more than it can in a country like ours, where farming infrastructure has been built out pretty efficiently.
Right. Yeah, I love to see kind of a tiered approach to regulation like what Canada is doing here, and not use the one size fits all or blanket approach, because the truth of the matter is different situations are different, and sometimes very different, and we should kind of regulate them accordingly. So yeah, really excited to see, and hopefully we can, the FAA can look north and see what Canada is doing, and hopefully get some of that data and start to put into place some of these regulations here. So last article of the day, and then we'll move into our interview with Patrick. So this is a new campaign calling for a ban on the NYPD, New York Police Department's drone use. So the campaign is a social media campaign, but it's really supporting a bill introduced by Senator Jessica Ramos out of New York City. And her bill effectively bans law enforcement from using drones for recording or collecting data on the general public within open spaces, which includes parks, concert spaces, and protests. The bill would also severely restrict any governmental use of drones without a warrant and ban the use of facial recognition. So, drones for good, drones for public safety, it's incredibly important. We talk about, some of these great use cases on this podcast and at other InterDrone content that we produce a lot. Public safety is a big sector that we work with. Patrick, I know you have a lot of experience in public safety as well. I mean, what do you think of this bill introduced by Senator Ramos? Where do we draw the line as a society, and how do we make sure we're not allowing government overreach, but at the same time, we're getting the value from this technology and from these tools?
Sure. I think that takes, frankly, a very nuanced approach. And unfortunately, nuance is not something our legislators seem to do real well. But we had more or less this exact same debate here in Oregon 5 years ago. And I hope that maybe what we did here can sort of be an exemplar to them. Let me begin by saying I'm 100% sympathetic with this impulse. I don't want to be spied on by a drone. I suspect none of you do either. I mean, so there's that. And then if anything, I think the last month or so has taught us that who you are and what color your skin is really colors the sort of interactions you have with law enforcement. And I think many of us are seeing for the first time, that law enforcement, can sometimes be a pretty blunt instrument depending on the population they're dealing with. And if you're, a member of that population, the idea of being spied on from the sky is not at all appealing. So I understand, particularly in this historical moment, the sort of drive for something like this. But at the same time, based on what happened here in Oregon, I'm very, very concerned that we're going to lose a lot of opportunities and use cases that would be totally uncontroversial and are universally beneficial. That can sometimes it's sort of the baby that ends up getting thrown out with the bathwater. And I'll give you an example, is that when we had this debate in 2015, I think it was, here in Oregon, and I repeatedly went down to the state legislature to testify, they wanted to say a lot like this, and I haven't read the New York bill, so I can't speak to the specifics, but a lot like this. It's like, law enforcement shall not use drones, period. We're moving on, except for a warrant in very highly controlled circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And I went down to the legislature and testified and said, look, I get that. I'm with you there. But, as some research I just did with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University showed, if you use a drone to map a crash site where two cars collided, you can shave like 80% of the time off that the road has to be closed while you're gathering that data. I mean, and they're not imaging the public in any meaningful way, but the officers at less risk because they're spending less time standing in traffic. The data is, just as good as what you get by setting up a total station, which takes like 2 hours to get done. And there are just a number of use cases like that, which, if you can help the general public, or at least the legislatures, understand them, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. We'd like the roads to be less congested, that sort of thing. So I really hope what happens in New York is they'll throttle back from this, blanket prohibition and, look into, where is there really no controversy? Where can drones do a lot of good and they're not capturing the public, et cetera, et cetera. And then here in Oregon, if you're going to use a drone for surveillance, you do need a warrant, and your law enforcement, you do need a warrant. And, there are a lot of cases, except in emergent circumstances, you can use one and then you have to answer for why it was so important you need to use. But the point is that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of upside to this technology. And when ideas like blanket prohibitions start being thrown around, I get really worried we're going to lose those totally non-controversial use cases where drones are nothing but a benefit to everybody involved.
Yeah,
totally agree. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
To your point on this current moment, just going into facial recognition, it's been proven that facial recognition is less accurate for people of color. So if there was there was nuance to what is being talked about here, maybe that use case comes off the table to create a better conversation with the public. I think also just in general, public safety use of drones, when, there's no transparency and they launch a program, that backfires. And sometimes that city loses drone use, period, because somebody, civil liberties, come into play and they talk about it. They say this is clearly, you've agitated the wrong people, or the right people actually, to shut you down. Romeo from DJI just posted something. I forget the name of the police department, but they had a monthly list of all the flights of that drone, what it was used for, how it was used to the public benefit, and where the records of what it recorded is. Things like that make a drone no different than a helicopter, just lower proximity. It's actually it's faster. It gets out of the way sooner if used properly. So I hope that in New York there's a lot going on. We had some of the biggest riots, so I think that the nerves are raw, and let's hope that somebody from the police side is able to actually represent what they've been doing with drones in New York, because most of the use cases are very mundane, that they could represent them realistically and sensitively, so we can still have this program continue.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to separate the types of technology. So I think it's very reasonable to have a meaningful conversation about the use of facial recognition. But to associate facial recognition with drones is not necessarily useful, right? Because facial recognition software can be attached to multiple different things. Here in Boston, right, we had the marathon bombing and stuff. They caught those people with closed caption TVs. All over Europe, they use closed caption TVs. I mean, there's different types of surveillance. So I get very nervous when people really want to link facial recognition or surveillance technology with drone technology. And I think it's more reasonable to have a meaningful conversation about the level of surveillance that you're comfortable with in communities, the technology like facial recognition that you're comfortable with police using, and focus on regulations around those technologies, not on drones only, because you're not going to accomplish your goal if you say you can't use drones, and what you really mean is you can't use facial recognition. Then you haven't accomplished your goal. And as Patrick said, you risk kind of throwing the babies out with the bathwater and limiting really non-controversial applications.
Yeah, it's really just a vehicle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think you are exactly right. And this is another thing that we talked about a lot back in 2015 here, is what is the difference between a drone and a 50-foot pole with a camera on it? Right. I mean, the only difference is the camera on the 50-foot pole is cheaper, more reliable, and flies for longer. I mean,
and people don't notice it. They don't know it's there. So if you set one of those up on the corner of a building, people aren't looking up and saying, "Oh, I'm being watched right now."
Yeah, it doesn't announce itself with a buzzing noise. Right. So there is like a psychological thing there. I think we have to respect that, though. That absolutely. I mean, I personally I get that anxiety too if I hear I'm like, who's flying that? Did they know how to fly? Where's the controller? I don't like his outfit. He probably doesn't know how to fly well.
Right.
But he's not wearing a jumpsuit like Patrick, so he must. But yeah, I think the general public who's even less informed about the technology, that fear is so much grander, because not knowing is what leads to that kind of anxiety. So the more we could communicate, the more we could have things like I forget which department, again, I wish I was going to start taking notes on this, but they have a Facebook page. Every time that drone goes out in the sky, that page gets updated. So if you wanted to contact the department about something wrong with that flight, you know where that drone came from. It's a police drone. It's over this ballpark right now. So the more we could do on that level, the more we could alleviate these fears, and make sure that the states and public safety departments are able to use these drones for great uses.
Right. Yeah. Agreed, totally.
I think to that point too. I mean, during what's happening right now in our country, the political unrest, the social justice initiatives, and people are looking for more transparency from their law enforcement. And so if there's a way that, like you were saying, Mike, that drone had logs of all the flights it did, and I don't know if it was showing other data that it was collecting, but if there's a way to kind of provide transparency through the use of drones, and also use them in situations that aren't uncompromising to privacy, maybe that people will be more open to that. And so trying to kind of put both of those factors or both of those forces together is maybe where we need to go to implement something like this.
I wonder what triggered this, because I would doubt that they were using these drones to fly over crowds to assess, what was going on with protests. That's a pretty risky flight. I know that they wanted to use it for New Year's on that level, but the winds were too high for that to actually be achieved as even a test. So I wonder if there was a specific thing that kicked this off, or if it was just a general I could get my name on this bill thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think Mike. I think you're exactly right. Is that fear is a great motivator, particularly in politics. And if you can drive the politics, if you can take something that people are afraid of, and George, like you said, it's drones. There's kind of this sinister. We don't know what they're doing with these things. They're evil. So you can say drones are bad. I'm fighting them. Therefore, I'm good. Therefore, you get reelected. And this is not to say there aren't legitimate concerns about the applications and uses of drones, but going back to your point, Mike, there's an awful lot you can do with a camera bolted to the side of a building. Drones are expensive, as you point out, risky to operate in an operating environment like that, in a way that a camera hanging on the side of a building never is. And I think, Miriam, this goes back to your point, is we need to decide what level of surveillance we're comfortable with, what level of that, and then address that across the whole spectrum instead of singling out drones as this unique threat, because they're really not. If I was
in New York what's going to come up
City
tomorrow?
Department, I'm sorry?
Something will be invented. Something new will be invented tomorrow. You don't know.
Yeah, and ultimately, if people are having issues with police at this current time in history, the structural issues that are causing that are not solved by shutting off the drone.
Right.
We're allowing officers to be armed. That's if you want to talk about a force instrument, if they're allowed to do that, they should be able to use a drone, which is essentially just a camera in the sky.
Right.
We created rules around how they're supposed to use their guns, and if they fail to follow through with those, the system has to keep up with it. If the drone has nothing to do with that equation, though.
Right. I think this comes back to
the group of 4 drone enthusiasts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we're
any bias here?
Yeah.
No.
Right. Well, that goes back to just one last point. Anthony De Molina, he made the point when working with the LAPD that the drones are not used to solve a problem after it rises. They're used to prevent a problem from arising. So, for instance, they had reports of somebody walking with a firearm. Now, instead of sending multiple police with a siren on and guns drawn to meet this person, they were able to fly over a drone, realize that it wasn't actually a firearm. I can't remember what the object was, but that stopped a problem before it even had a chance to escalate. So, when you think of situations like that, it's tough to make the case that drones are unsafe as long as we're providing transparency and the citizens are feeling assured that
less unnecessary interactions is always going to benefit all people, police and citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's very reminiscent of what Chula Vista is finding with their very advanced drone program, is that the idea of the drone as a first responder is that some percentage of cases, but the drone goes out, just like what you were describing, Mike. The drone goes out, checks it out, says no problem. The guy's got a rate. Drone goes home. Everybody's happy. There is no risky interaction of law enforcement thinking they're confronting an armed suspect. So it's win-win.
Right. Great. Well, we're going to take a quick break. I think we'll excuse Mike and Miriam, and we'll jump into the interview portion with Patrick. Miriam, if just any final thoughts, or how can people get a hold of you, read some of your writing to learn more, and we'll put those links in the description.
Sure. Subscribe to our newsletter at dronelife.com, and you can always reach me at miriam@dronelife.com.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for being here, and we'll see everybody in just a minute.
All right.
Take care,
nice
guys.
to talk to you all. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning back in to the InterDrone Podcast. We are joined today with Patrick Sherman. He is the founder of the Roswell Flight Test Crew, and And Patrick, you've been in the space, as we kind of spoke about at the beginning of this recording, for, I guess, over 10 years now, which is pretty incredible. I think a lot of people may not even be aware that there was a drone industry 10 years ago. But can you just talk a little bit more about your career progression, kind of how you started in drones, and I guess how your career has really evolved over the past 10 or so years?
Sure. Well, I'd say 10 years ago, it wasn't so much an industry as it was maybe a movement or a group of crazy people who found themselves enthralled by the same technology. That's a great question. I became involved. Well, let me take a step back. Essentially, I've spent my whole career as some form of a journalist or a public information professional, marketing communications person. So my whole life has really been about communications. And 10 years ago, I was a journalist, a newspaper journalist, and I was on the public safety beat. So I spent a lot of time with firefighters and law enforcement officers, and so sort of came to understand their problems and their issues and whatnot. And a friend of mine came to me and said, hey, in Europe, they're putting video cameras on the noses of radio-controlled airplanes and sending that video back live. Wow, that's really cool. So in any event, so I was just fascinated with the technology. I mean, just as a technical geek, so there's that. But then, about 5 minutes after he told me that, I started thinking, gosh, wouldn't this be a great benefit to the public safety community? A police officer could look around behind a building before committing himself to going in there, or a firefighter, she could use that to, survey the site. And when you learn about what standard practice is, I'll give you an example. When a fire engine rolls up on the scene, the company officer jumps out of the truck, the other firefighters start pulling hoses and whatnot. Before they try and get people out of the building, before they start spraying water, before they do anything, the company officer walks all the way around the whole building just to make sure they understand the situation. That takes, 3, 4, 5 minutes. How much house is burned in that time? How many victims are potentially in trouble? And so if you could deliver a level of situational awareness that is better than that in less time than that, that's a big deal for, firefighters. And so I thought, these drones, these, FPV, first person view systems, could just be a huge benefit for that. So we started tinkering around and building some initial aircraft. And I just cannot overemphasize what a painful trial and error process that was. I mean, people who've taken up drones in the next few years are used to, completely reliable return to home, stone steady, stabilization, etc. It was not like that. So, to make that true. As a matter of fact, the Roswell flight test crew here, our motto, Semper Cadentis, means always crashing, which was a sort of a nod to those early days, because it was just nonstop. But so in any event, so we were doing this mostly for our own enjoyment, and I suppose because we were out in public doing it, people started asking us more and more questions, and so my sort of lifelong, aspect as a communicator, I thought, well, we should make up a website and start putting this information online. And pretty soon that turned into a YouTube channel. And so that's really how it all started, was just discovering this amazing, neat technology and then, sharing it with people. And that led to some, opportunities along the way, which of course led to further opportunities. We started working with FLIR, the thermal imaging camera maker, to put, we made our first flight with a FLIR in 2012. If that puts it in a perspective, which is several years before FLIRs were integrated into DJI's products. So that's it. But I really, throughout it, I see myself sort of as a commentator, a critic, an educator, a journalist in this field, almost more so than a participant as a pilot. I mean, I love flying. I do it frequently. I've gotten to do some really interesting missions over the years, and I'm incredibly grateful for those opportunities. But I guess I think that my sort of my biggest contribution is to helping people understand the industry, think about the issues that are involved in it in a sort of serious and substantial way. And that's so I think that's what it's been all about. And I've been hugely blessed in that continuing, because I was recently brought on board by Embry-Riddle's Worldwide Department of Flight. as an adjunct instructor, and that's been an amazing, opportunity, and opportunity to learn from other people who think like I do about drones. So anyway.
Yeah, well, and we absolutely thank you for, just as an industry, thank you for sharing all that information. Information is so is just paramount to emerging industries, emerging technology, especially in industries where we're a little bit waiting sometimes a stronger regulatory framework. So, just getting out that information out there is progressing the industry as a whole substantially. You mentioned a couple just a second ago that you've done some really cool missions. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about if there's any particular missions which stood out from in your memory, in your career, any kind of really fascinating UAS success stories or use cases that you've been able to do.
Sure. I think probably the most compelling stories I think of come from those early days of like 2010 to maybe 2013. And I'll give you a few specific examples. Because of my background as a journalist working alongside public safety, I sort of knew journalists, and you're a journalist, sort of have this way of sort of infiltrating things. We know how to get inside organizations and talk to people, and so I had all those sort of journalism skills. And so, whereas I think a lot of our contemporaries at the time, that 2010 to 2013, were building this technology and flying it, and also doing a lot of great sharing of what they were learning on the internet, what I think set us apart was that we went out to document not just the use of the aircraft, but the aircraft's operation in environments where other people hadn't thought about it yet. So, for example, the first video ever on our YouTube channel is us flying drones alongside hot air balloons, in 2011. So, I mean, that was not many people had even thought about that yet, much less done it. And so it was an opportunity, I think, for people to see possibilities, not just, see the aircraft fly and have to use their imagination, but to really, see it in action. Mm-hmm. And then, again, with those connections, we were able in 2000, I guess it was probably still 2011, to fly with a group of firefighters doing a big burn to learn where they burned down this entire apartment complex. And that video just took off, particularly with the fire service on the internet, because it was a chance to really glimpse the future. And it's more and more becoming sort of a standard piece of equipment now, but it was really cutting edge stuff back then. And so I think that, again, that began to sort of open up people's eyes to the possibility of this technology. Right. And then probably one of the things of which I'm most proud is I think it must have been 2013, we went out to West Virginia because we were, a handful of people who sort of could even conceive of, putting a thermal imaging camera on a 2-pound drone. And they were having some significant problems with environmental degradation and trying to restore native fish habitat. And so the West Virginia University wanted to answer a very basic question, and nobody knew the answer, which is, can a thermal camera detect variations in water temperature? Because if the fish like cold water, much like our salmon here in the Northwest, but all the trees being cut down and all the other environmental damage had raised the water temperature to the point where they could, the fish were in real trouble. And so the scientists and conservationists would go out and they'd install, fixtures, little water breaks, etc., back eddies, to help the fish, to give them a place to, hopefully they could sort of rest up in cooler water. But they were essentially dropping these things at random. They had no way of knowing, hey, is this part of the river, measurably cooler than that? So they heard about what we were doing with drones and thermal cameras, and they thought, well, could we use a thermal camera to survey the whole river and identify, cold spots, and then focus our restoration efforts where they do the most good? And so they invited us to come out, which we did, and we were able to do it. Ultimately, we sort of had to overcome a few hurdles in the field, but we were able to detect variations in surface water temperature, and that, was a great benefit to their program. And I thought, again, happening in 2013, a real testament to what the future of this industry was going to bring. Okay. And also about this time, we sought and got permission to fly over the Grand Coulee Dam in eastern Washington state up here in the Pacific Northwest. And I just called up and eventually got a hold of the public information officer at the dam and said, hey, we'd like to fly our little, helicopters over your dam. Would that be okay? And, she asked some folks and the answer came back yes. And so we did. And we were up at 5 a.m. in the morning to cohere with their flight plan. But we flew over the Grand Coulee Dam. And I think that there's always sort of a wisp of sadness with that project because it was really cool, captured some unprecedented images, but it was also, I could sort of start to feel the frontier closing at that point. The drone industry was growing up, it was maturing, and that's of course a good thing, but sort of the ability to, call somebody up and say, hey, I want to fly a drone at your X was kind of going away. And so we've gained a tremendous amount. I would never go back, but in terms of sort of high adventure, the industry has not been quite the same since for the past 7 years or so. And that's a good thing, but sure. I do sometimes miss it.
Sometimes miss the good old days. What industry verticals are you most excited about for UAS use, and where do you think we may see some of the most growth as we progress, the second half of 2020 and then into the next few years?
Well, I think I think when you ask anybody a question like that, you sort of have to take into account two things. What is their perspective on the industry and what are they personally interested in? I remain very devoted to public safety applications. So I say public safety when I get a question like that, because the dynamic, nature of the work they do appeals to me, because it's a place where you can have very concrete examples where you're saving lives, using this technology. So it's, so people can like, oh yeah, I get that. That's immediately clear. Whereas if you increase crop yields by 12%, you may save 100 lives or 1,000 lives by feeding people who would otherwise go hungry, but it's not quite the same. So for me personally, I would say, public safety. And the other thing I would say is my perspective on the industry tends to be sort of soda straw-like. It's very narrowly focused. Maybe that's the way everybody's perspective in the industry is. But that said, I guess what I believe is that we're seeing a lot of good use cases and things like mapping and surveying. I think ironically, in many ways for, aircraft, which started out sort of the premise of live dynamic video, seem to be having their greatest impact, flying, sort of a lawnmower style missions in the sky, completely unexciting from a piloting or maneuvering standpoint, but, they generate just reams of incredibly useful data. And so I think that's an area where a lot of people see the value. And so that's where I think we're seeing a lot of development. Yeah. And then alongside that, I heard here at Oregon State University down in Corvallis, they have a very robust drone and robotics program. And a member of that program said to me, and this is something that's going to stick with me forever. He said, our scientists tell us drones are the new microscope. It's a new way, a new fundamental way of looking at the world and categorizing it and analyzing it in a way that just wasn't possible before at the level of detail, the level of resolution. And so I think scientific discovery is going to be a really key contribution. I mean, nobody makes a lot of money on the front end of scientific discovery, but it does have the ability to help us better care for our environment, solve real world problems. So I guess those are the things I'm seeing is mapping and surveying, and then mapping and surveying specifically in the service of science.
Yeah, I think that kind of comparison to microscopes is really interesting, just allowing us to look at things from a new perspective. Yeah, right. How have you seen the current pandemic affect the industry? We've seen maybe some companies are less likely to invest money in some startups. A lot of drone companies are more or less startups or early stage companies who don't have a long runway with regards to cash, or maybe they're not profitable right now. Then again, we saw BVLOS waiver early this year for inspection. Here in the United States, we've seen drone deliveries start to happen a little bit more. What are some of your high level thoughts on how the pandemic has really affected UAS?
Well, actually, I think you just gave the sort of summary you gave sort of lines up with what I'm seeing. Is that like, like restaurants, like barbershops, like ballet companies, like so many different sorts of organizations, the advent of the coronavirus and its continued spread has really slammed the brakes on all economic activity. And based on what I've seen, that certainly applies to most drone operations. I mean, and even, just most companies working on drones, because it's, if you're trying to build drones, like you say, I know a lot of people in this industry sort of, go from one drone sale to the next, or, one project to the next. And so when the people with the real money, the clients, turn off the spigots, that's a real problem. And then likewise for, hardware manufacturers, drones are, at least I don't believe drones are yet seen as, sort of business essentials. Companies are figuring out what they're good for, and they are using them more and more. And I don't doubt in the long term that will continue. But, when your, stock price just hit a brick wall and, you have to lay off 1,000 employees, this is not the time most companies are going to think, hey, we should launch this new initiative where we're going to fly little aircraft around our facilities. I just kind of like, let's maybe hold off on that until we're sure that we're not going to end up like Mad Max. And then I think the final thing, and you were exactly right to point this out, is to a certain extent, it's catalyzed some use cases of drones for delivery, outside the United States. We've seen, drones used to check the temperature of crowds. I'm not really sure about the efficacy of that one, but the pandemic has created some new opportunities for drones to show their possibilities, and that legitimate crisis, which can tend to move things forward. It's like if the FAA probably wouldn't have approved that BVLOS waiver, last year, but now that we can save lives and cut down the cycle time on getting COVID tests back by 2 days, that becomes a very compelling reason for action. And so I think that's drones are having a bit of a moment here as they show they can help us fight this terrible plague.
Right. And I think, as we spoke a little bit earlier too, drones can have sometimes a stigma, worthy or unworthy of. That's up for debate, but people do have these kind of predisposed notions of what and you said the word earlier, sinister, which I think is a perfect word for it. They're kind of a little, people aren't sure what's going on, they don't know it, and it's new. And so I think, on the other side of this pandemic, we are seeing drones being used in some pretty good lights. So I wonder if that will change the narrative a little bit and kind of public perception. As we move forward.
I think so. I hope. Maybe I should say I hope so.
Yeah.
We're dug in pretty deep because of the use of drones overseas, by the military. That the drones are instruments of war. So, I think nobody in the industry sees it that way. But I think in terms of educating the public, we've still got a long ways to go. But hey. Anything that'll help, I'm all for.
We'll take it. We'll take it. Right. So just final question for you, Patrick, and we'll let you go. What, if anything, do you think is holding the industry back? And we ask this question a lot. We get a pretty similar answer a lot of the times. Technology's there, regulation maybe not so much. So if you are going to say some part of regulation is holding the industry back, what is most important for the U.S., for the FAA to get right in terms of regulation and kind of taking the next step as a sustainable industry?
Sure. Well, I'll jump on the bandwagon and say regulation is holding the drone industry back. And I think that's true. I think it's very telling that, in 2016, we got Part 107, and there has been sort of no further certification, training. There's been nothing more for drones for 4 years. And I come from the manned side of aviation as well. And, there you can be a private pilot, you can be a sport pilot, you can be an instrument rated pilot, you can be a commercial pilot, you can fly seaplanes. And each of these different functions comes with a new certificate. It says you've been trained. Obviously, just like, getting your private pilot license or your Part 107, you got to go take a test. Unlike 107, you actually have to show you can control the aircraft, all those sorts of good things. And so it seems to me that the FAA is kind of using waivers, like a daylight operations waiver, in lieu of developing additional ratings. I think if I mean, imagine manned aircraft if you could fly a Cessna 172 and you wanted to fly a Cessna 172 with floats, so a seaplane. Imagine if you had to write a waiver to fly a seaplane. I mean, people just think that was crazy.
Yeah.
So why in 4 years has the FAA not been able to come up with, standardized training and testing protocol that you can, certify you're competent to fly at night, and that can be a rating you can add to your credential. And I mean, actually, it's interesting. I'm working on an article right now. As a matter of fact, when this call ends, I got to jump back on my computer and to start and finish this article about getting your night waiver for rotor drone. And, it's kind of amazing, that this is something that still requires a waiver. And not, well, the premise of my article is that everybody can do a waiver, but it's time consuming. It's, it can be difficult. There's a lot of
scalable.
Yeah, it's not simple. And so there's kind of, there's kind of that. And obviously, if we could put into place both the regulatory and technological framework to allow for beyond visual line of sight, for routine operations over people, I mean, all the stuff everybody talks about, all that would be true. However, if I may, I think I will add an additional hurdle to your, the regulations are holding us back when it comes to the industry. And I think another thing that's holding us back is sort of a failure to understand sort of the role of drones in the organization and in the society. When I was coming up, and certainly there are tens of thousands of others like me, we sort of envisioned something that the drones would turn out something like the rest of the aviation industry, where there would be specialized people whose only job was to operate the aircraft. And so if a corporation or an organization needed aerial video or surveying, they would call, your friendly local drone professional who would come down, do that work for them, give them the end result, and, take the check to the bank and cash it. And I think if the last few years have taught us anything, is that's not the way it's working out. The overwhelming number of people who are relying, or organizations, the overwhelming number of organizations who are relying on drone technology are taking people who are already working for the organization and training them as drone pilots. I mean, the possibilities are you can hire me, who's good at drones, but doesn't know a thing about, electrical systems, and I can fly the drone around your power lines, but then I've got to hand that data off to a lineman who actually can understand what's happening there and make the correct decisions. Or you can send the lineman to a week-long course, and they can become a drone pilot, and they can do all their own analysis right on the spot. And I think that's the way the industry has moved. But I think the problem is that I think what people need to understand is that when you become a drone pilot, even if you're full-time, even if it says engineer on your business card or farmer, or whatever it says, you are at least part-time an aviator. And I think that a lot of organizations have yet to sort of make that fundamental leap. And frankly, a lot of people who use drones professionally are not yet thinking of themselves as aviators, as part of a separate community from the regular professional community, which has existed for more than 100 years and has its own traditions and ideas and whatnot. And so I think that for the drone industry to succeed in the long term, the people who use drones in organizational settings are going to have to come to appreciate that this is a new community they're joining. It's the aviation community. And so, because until you do that, you're not really going to make good decisions about risk, about safety, about those sorts of things. And so I think that providing that education, which has obviously been my personal goal from day one, is kind of a missing piece in it too. So one man's opinion.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you make some really good points there. And, we've had that debate back and forth. Is it easier to teach a surveyor how to fly a drone, or is it easier to teach a drone pilot how to survey or map? So, I think, it's a really interesting debate. But
well, surveying is actually an interesting use case only because in Oregon, at least, this is regulated at the state level, but in Oregon, at least, you have to become a professional surveyor is not a not a trivial undertaking at all. There's a lot of education. There's like an internship. There are multiple layers, and it's, it'll take you a week. In a week I could, get somebody to pass the 107 test with flying colors, but take 3 years for somebody to teach me to really be a proper surveyor. So,
right.
So I think in Oregon, at least, the people who want to plug drones into surveying are necessarily going to be the ones working with the surveyors.
Sure.
Who are surveyors themselves.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Well, Patrick, any final thoughts before we let you go?
Well, just kind of frankly, how much I miss you guys, certainly the InterDrone team with whom I've been associated, since at least 2015, and just more broadly, sort of the drone community. I mean,
Right.
we've all seen, you guys have been postponed till, late in the year, and I really hope we sort of get things under control so that goes off as planned, because I am anxious to get myself to a drone event. And Exponential's also been postponed. Commercial UAV was, shut down entirely as a physical event.
Yep.
And, I miss folks. I think there's a lot of advantages to getting out and meeting with people face to face and talking things through and really understanding what they're doing. And to be sure, things like this podcast help a lot, but it's no substitute for being there. So I'm hoping we come up with a vaccine, or maybe drones can magically sprinkle some mist over us that'll make us immune to the coronavirus or something, because I'm ready to get out there and meet with some folks.
Yeah, I totally hear you. We echo that sentiment as well. It's definitely not the same as meeting up in person, and the conversations aren't quite the same, and you don't get that that same level of information sharing. But we're all doing the best we can, and until we get there, and we appreciate for all the work that you do in the space, and really appreciate you hopping on and joining us today. How can people find out a little bit more about what you do? How can they get a hold of you to ask any follow-up questions, or learn more about the Roswell Flight Test Crew?
Well, I actually let me say one other thing, if I may, but I will answer your question.
Please.
That is going to say thank you to you and the whole InterDrone crew, because in addition to meeting people in person, which is great, with seeing hardware with your own eyes really helps you understand something in a way I don't think you can get from a photograph or a production video. Being able to pick something up in your hands and hold it, and talk to a knowledgeable person about it and everything, that's the value you guys deliver with InterDrone. So I think certainly it's the people, but it's also the chance to see the hardware in person. Anyway, should someone want to get in touch with me, probably the easiest way is just to go to roswellflighttestcrew.com, just written out, no special characters or anything. Or for the truly masochistic, you can try to send me an email directly, but my email address is lucidity@roswellflighttestcrew.com. So if you can work out how to spell that, you're welcome to send me an email. But otherwise, just head over to the website. There's a contact us link. Click on it, brings up a text box. Type whatever you want. Comes straight to me.
Perfect. Well, great. And we'll put that link in the description below. So thanks again for being here. Thank you to Miriam, who was on earlier, and everybody for tuning in. And we will see everybody next week. So have a great rest of your week.
All right. Take care.
Bye, Patrick.
Bye.